It's Dragon Ball, but not as you remember it. It's Goku through a lens darkly. It's not Dragon Ball, but Dragon Boy. It's not Goku, but Tongpoo. A bootleg knockoff? Nope. This is our main man, Toriyama. This is what could have been, but ultimately wasn't. Welcome to the stories of the Dragon Ball prototypes in Dragon Ball Dissection. Gaiden. Like my plan to eradicate the science video in 2020, this was a Patreon-sponsored video. Thank you to all of my patrons for keeping this channel going, and to Leaf Blady, who donated far above the reward tiers to make sure this happened. If you can, please consider becoming a member. Yes, this Dragon Ball Dissection episode is a group effort, but it's also all about me. This is the first Dragon Ball Dissection episode where I took my own book and scanned it, which makes this feel personal. The scans aren't perfect. I didn't take the book apart, which means the gutter margins ended up a bit blurry, but I did painstakingly try to fix that all throughout January. And let's face it, I upload these videos at 7:20, you're never gonna notice. I hope. But yes, that means everything you see in this video was created by me! Well, I guess I didn't draw or write the stories. Toriyama Akira did some of this, I guess. The answer to where Dragon Ball begins can vary from person to person. To a lot of people, it seems Dragon Ball begins right here, at its 195th chapter, or more likely, its 154th episode. An other lot of people will say that Dragon Ball actually began with this little boy writing a log back home, reminding that first lot that we just celebrated Dragon Ball's 40th anniversary a few months ago. And even others will point out that Dragon Ball was based on the classic Chinese fable Journey to the West. While that's not Dragon Ball per se, it is the most obvious inspiration for it. Could it not be said that Dragon Ball begins there? But that leaves a pretty big gap. Surely Dragon Ball did not fully spring forth out of Journey to the West. It is true, it didn't. Dragon Ball may have officially begun in November 1984, but the earliest published works related to it first saw the light of day over a year earlier. The creative process is a funny one. Nothing you create exists in a vacuum. The things you love subtly influence you. What you've created in the past influences you. You take little bits and refine them over time, reusing your favorite jokes or references. Maybe these callbacks or motifs or patterns are so subtle that you don't even recognize them. And then there are times when your editor specifically tells you to draw stories about martial arts because you're purposely trying to come up with a new series to replace the one you're already famous for, so naturally when those stories are popular with readers and are reworked into a series, you just reuse a lot of those ideas. According to Toriyama's editor, Torishima Kazuhiko, while we were thinking of what to do for the next serialized work after Dr. Slump ended, Toriyama drew various one-shots for Weekly Jump and Monthly Fresh Jump. There was a good response to Dragon Boy. And according to Toriyama, I was stupid enough to mention to my editor, Torishima-san, how I constantly watched Jackie Chan's Drunken Master and whatnot, so he told me, if you like it so much, you should draw something like that. But liking something and wanting to draw it are two completely different things, so I didn't particularly want to do that. I sure can relate to that. Sometimes it's hard to mix business with pleasure. Regardless, Torishima held the leash, which led to Toriyama creating two martial arts-inspired fantasy stories, Dragon Boy and The Adventure of Tongpoo, both released in 1983. These are often referred to as the Dragon Ball prototypes. I'd argue they're akin to television pilots, standalone works that give a prospective buyer an idea of what a concept would be like if it went to series. However you want to think of them, they are the primordial ooze from which Dragon Ball sprang. It has always been my policy in Dragon Ball Dissection to examine stories primarily through the lens of their original creation, rather than placing them in a more modern context. However, since Dragon Boy and The Adventure of Tongpoo largely exist as creative preludes to Dragon Ball, I don't think it's unfair to compare these to the story that they ultimately served as the inspiration for. I'm not saying that there is no application or value for Toriyama's one-shot comics outside of their relation to Dragon Ball. However, it's clear that Dragon Ball is why we are talking about these two stories today. To anyone with even the slightest familiarity with Dragon Ball, the parallels will be immediately obvious. And by that, I mostly mean parallels to the first story arc of Dragon Ball. There's not going to be a proto-Vegeta here, is what I'm saying. Dragon Boy is a 2-chapter miniseries, and The Adventure of Tongpoo is a standalone chapter. Despite being a single chapter, though, it is actually longer than both chapters of Dragon Boy combined. Both of them focus on a young boy, simple but earnest with great strength, teaming up on an adventure with a hot young girl. Both of them combine settings in the natural world with more advanced technology. In both stories, the protagonist reveals a hidden secret behind his strength. In both stories, the girl is vain and delicate, yet violent, and serves as mostly useless comic relief. The girls end up naked, a lot. There's practically a straight line from Tong Tong and the Princess to Tongpoo and Plamo to Son Goku and Bluma. It just goes to show how central that relationship is to the earliest days of Dragon Ball, given how that's clearly the core idea that Toriyama is creating and refining throughout all these works. Surprisingly, both of these stories are also very different from one another, and each one introduces new ideas to the Dragon Ball mythos. So let's look at each one of these individually. Let's start with Dragon Boy, released in Fresh Jump's August and October 1983 issues. In a vaguely Chinese world, young martial artist Tong Tong studies under his master, Go-Roshi-sama. During a recent war, the princess of the Flower Kingdom was forced to take refuge here. Now that the war is over, the master tasks Tong Tong with returning her home. Tong Tong has never seen a girl before and is shocked by the anatomical differences. She, in turn, is a massive load. Knowing that there might be danger on this journey, Go-Roshi gives Tong Tong a Long Pao, or Dragon Pearl. If he's in trouble, Tong Tong can focus all of his ki into it and cause a dragon to appear. The master also warns his student never to let anyone see his back. Of course, in the very next panel, Tong Tong has his back to the princess. So off they go. I should say something about the title. Dragon Boy obviously sounds almost exactly like Dragon Ball. Like, it's amazing how close we were to the actual series name right from the word go. However, there is a slightly larger difference you might not have noticed. See, Dragon Ball is an English title, period, be it in the manga or the anime. There aren't any Japanese words here. Even the kana below it to tell its native audience how to read it just says Doragon Boru. But as you can see here, Dragon Boy's logo is written in Japanese, and the kanji characters could be read as Kiryu Shonen, which literally translates to Writing Dragon Boy. But the kana above it spells out Doragon Boy. So while Dragon Boy is meant to be spoken in English too, it's still keeping one foot in its original language. It makes sense though. As Dragon Boy takes place in a more Eastern world, its title is fittingly more Eastern. Jumping back to the story, the interactions between Tong Tong and the unnamed princess are probably Dragon Boy's weakest element. Their bickering is the core of the story, but the execution of it doesn't come across as very integrated into the story. The two start out their quest on an anachronistically modern skiff vehicle. They have a quick argument over who should be driving, and then immediately after that's resolved, Tong Tong announces they have to abandon the vehicle to go over the mountains anyway. At one point, the princess randomly asks Tong Tong about his backstory and parents. Tong Tong laughs it off, saying his parents abandoned him because he was a monster. And then the scene just ends. It certainly seems like that line should spark further inquiry, but no. Compare that to its equivalent scene in Dragon Ball, where Bluma asks about Goku's upbringing because he had just mentioned his grandpa in context of their sleeping arrangements. And also compare how that scene continues, with Goku assuming that Bluma had been abandoned because of the butt on her chest. The conversation flows much more naturally and ties back into earlier character interactions. For another example, in Dragon Boy, Tongtong sees the princess bathing naked and makes comments about her anatomy. And that's it. She has next to no reaction. Compare that to Dragon Ball, where this same revelation is punctuated by humor and in-character consequences. I do like, however, that instead of the butt on the chest joke that Dragon Ball makes, Tongtong instead interprets breasts as the princess having extremely pronounced pectoral muscles. The butt on the chest is probably funnier, but I was tickled by this one too. Finally, there's another scene where Tongtong and the princess are traveling through a desert. The princess is not handling the climate well and demands water. Tongtong immediately notices a conveniently placed shrine with a well. What incredible timing! And that awkward transition leads to an awkward fight. Again, compare this to Dragon Ball's desert, where the characters only end up there due to unfortunate circumstances and where its denizens seek them out. This just feels too convenient. Obviously, some allowances have to be made for the shorter format. Dragon Ball has the virtue of more time to set up and pay off these character connections and jokes. I'm not necessarily saying this to criticize Toriyama. If anything, I'm impressed how he took these very rough ideas and refined them for Dragon Ball to the point that seeing them in this embryonic state comes across as jarring in their lack of elegance. The so-called Dragon Pearl seems like an obvious precursor to the Dragon Balls. Heck, there are even 7 orbs on the second chapter's title page. However, this iteration is fairly pointless. When activated, the Pearl hatches a tiny dragon who accomplishes nothing in the battle and disappears. Now, it's hard for me not to compare this to Dragon Ball and be disappointed. I want to try to dismiss that perspective though. Just because the Dragon Balls are important to Dragon Ball doesn't mean this Pearl has to be important as well. After all, its uselessness could be seen as a subversion of expectations. It's set up to fail. It still seems weird, though. It's not enough of a subversion for the joke to really land. It's set up without much fanfare. It's paid off in the first chapter and then goes away. It feels more random than a punchline. However, its failure ends up revealing that Tongtong has hidden dragon wings. He is the Dragon Boy of the title. This subversion does pay off in a fairly funny way. Presumably this was kept under wraps because master and student were afraid that Tongtong would be ostracized for not being normal. However, the chapter ends with the princess revealing that she's simply annoyed he didn't reveal this earlier because he could have been flying her this entire time. I like that. And I'd argue it's a better conclusion to the first chapter than Dragon Ball having Blooma pee herself. But don't think there aren't any pee gags in this version. Yes, that originated here too. In the second chapter, I guess Toriyama realized that having his characters be able to fly over all the obstacles wouldn't be very interesting, so Tongtong explains that he can't do it for very long. Back to walking it is. Little do they know they're being watched by a tiny creature. Suddenly a handsome man appears claiming to be a traveler and convinces the smitten princess to give him her food. However, it's revealed that Ping Yao is actually a shapeshifter, whose natural form is a kind of blobby cat. Tongtong scares him off with his advanced strength, and the duo continue on to a big bridge. Ping Yao returns, warning them of a monster who guards it. It turns out that the monster is an old robot from the war who thinks the war is still going on. Tongtong fights him for a while to no avail until Ping Yao transforms into a soldier to inform the robot that the war is over and he did his job well. Meanwhile, the princess pees herself and constantly complains about having peed herself. And yeah, at least Dragon Ball sets up that Blooma needs to go to the bathroom and is interrupted by the pterodactyl kidnapping her, so her peeing herself is a payoff to that setup. Here, the princess just pees herself, either because she just got that scared, or because she hasn't been doing her Kegels. Just like with Dragon Ball Chapter 1, the pee joke is used as the closer to the chapter, but in a more indirect way. Because her clothes are soiled, she insists that Ping Yao transform into clothes for her to wear. Since Ping Yao operates by Ultraman rules, he actually does make the comparison, he can only hold his transformations for 3 minutes, so the chapter ends with the princess, you guessed it, naked. The closing narration says that it's still a long way to the Flower Kingdom, but I guess they never get there because this is where the story ends. The inspirations for Dragon Ball are numerous and obvious. Both introduce us to the protagonist by showing him destroy a very sturdy object. There is the character of the Go-Roshi, which means Old Master. That obviously evolves into the somewhat different-looking Muten-Roshi, or Heavenly Martial Arts Master for Dragon Ball, who also owns a magical flying cloud. The Go-Roshi tests his student by throwing kunai at him. Tongtong replies in kind, and one of them ends up lodged in Go-Roshi's head, a joke that is very clearly reused and improved on in Dragon Ball. This is definitely an example where bigger ends up being funnier. Ping Lao obviously gets repurposed into the shape-shifting Oolong and Pu'er. Oolong becomes a very similar, although much more Western-flavored, handsome man in order to trick Bluma. Both are scared off when the hero destroys something. Both are put upon by the girl to give them things they need. However, the design is much more reminiscent of Pu'er, as is his introduction of spying on our heroes. And obviously, there are all the other parallels I mentioned, such as the unfamiliarity with anatomy, characters traveling through a desert, the pee jokes. The hybrid setting of classic and technological don't fit together as well as they do in Dragon Ball. The vehicle we see at the beginning, the one that's abandoned almost immediately, is the only piece of modern technology until the robot at the end. It makes the modern aesthetic feel like a random addition to this otherwise outdated setting, unlike Dragon Ball's more obvious fusion. But the attempts to blend the two, as well as the characters, the journey, even the name, all come across as obvious forebears to Dragon Ball itself. The Adventure of Tongpoo, by comparison, has a couple of the characters, but surprisingly lacks all of the rest of those elements. It's a very different story. However, it still delivers quite a few inspirations to Dragon Ball. Tongpoo premiered in Weekly Shonen Jump number 52, 1983. Like Dragon Boy, its logo is presented in Japanese as Tongpoo Daiboken, or Tongpoo Great Adventure, with the English title The Adventure of Tongpoo off to the side. The Adventure of Tongpoo serves as, well, an adventure of a kid named Tongpoo. What a shock. Rather than Tong Tong's whimsical journey through a Chinese-inspired landscape, Tongpoo is awakened from his cryosleep on a spaceship. His mission is to terraform new worlds. While Dragon Ball would eventually travel into outer space, this still feels very outside of its wheelhouse. Tongpoo wakes up just in time for his ship to explode, but he's able to take a landing craft to a nearby planet. By sheer coincidence, it turns out that a previous expedition also crash-landed here, and Tongpoo meets and teams up with that ship's only survivor, Plamo. They track down the monster that had killed her crewmates in an attempt to steal his ship and get off of the planet. However, they ultimately get into a fight with the monster, revealing that Tongpoo, like Tong Tong before him, has a secret that makes him super strong. Keeping with the setting, Tongpoo is actually a cyborg. And this actually uses the word cyborg instead of Dragon Ball's Jinzo Ningen. Winning the battle but failing to get the ship, the two heroes return to the single-occupancy landing craft, but Tongpoo gets to hang out outside of it given that he can survive in space. They search for a new planet or home, but we never see if they find one because the story ends here. Just like the earlier prototype, I feel this has a glaring weakness. Dragon Boys was having scenes that just happened randomly. Tongpoo's is the whole thing about the alien ship. They track it down in an attempt to steal it to get off the planet, right? However, Tongpoo examines the controls for one panel, determines he can't drive it, and then just decides to blow the whole thing up. That seems both extremely short-sighted and very pointless. Maybe with some time you could learn. I do like Tongpoo's jury-rigged time bomb made by wedging a grenade between two blocks of ice. It gives the ensuing battle sequence a fun ticking clock. But the whole thing just seems like an excuse for itself. He doesn't even consult with Plamo before deciding to destroy their method of leaving this planet. Even Gilligan's Island makes more sense when their plans to get home fail. There are a lot of good gags here, even the ones that don't make it into Dragon Ball at least deserve mention. Toriyama has fun with the idea of automated space travel where humans' needs are taken care of by machine while they're asleep. My favorite is Tongpoo pointing out the unnecessary butt-wiping machine that takes up an inordinately large amount of the ship's space. Interestingly, we get to see Toriyama experiment with the right combination of character dynamics. The adventure of Tongpoo basically reverses what would become Goku and Bluma. Here, Tongpoo is technologically savvy, while Plamo, a portmanteau of plastic models, is naive and ignorant. Still, she is an essential evolutionary link between the Flower Kingdom princess and the final Bluma. Plamo's aesthetic is much more Western. Her main trait is using her feminine wiles to try to seduce villains. She spends most of the chapter in a very skimpy outfit that only becomes more uncomfortable when you realize that she's 14 years old. While neither of these proto-Blumas have any of the technical expertise that the final version would be most known for, Plamo does have a skill unique to her character. When questioned by Tongpoo why someone so useless would be taken on a terraforming mission, she reveals that she actually has telekinesis. After a very, very, very long time, she can successfully bend a single spoon. It's funny, but it doesn't go anywhere. Just like in Dragon Ball, there is a scene where the characters take a bath together, and the girl freaks out when she realizes that the boy is 14 years old. In Dragon Ball, Bluma will occasionally shoot Son Goku when she feels he has crossed a line. That originates here. I think Tongpoo might do it better, though. He happens upon her while she's bathing, she freaks out, they introduce each other, she kindly asks him if he knows how to use the gun that she has. Tongpoo explains in great detail how to use the gun. She thanks him, then she shoots at him. Wouldn't have worked in Dragon Ball, but that's hilarious. There's even a moment where, when her sexy outfit fails to impress the villain, Plamo suggests that he might be into men instead, an idea reused during the Red Ribbon Army arc with General Blue. However, the most obvious element Tongpoo introduces to what will ultimately become Dragon Ball is a technology that can shrink down large objects to a portable size. They're even called capsules. Rather than the hoi poi capsules of Dragon Ball that refer to throwing, these are instead called iro or variety capsules. These capsules, while still convenient, are far less so than their Dragon Ball counterpart. Rather than featuring a simple plunger, these capsules have to be boiled in water to activate. Strangely though, this story has little need for them. Remember how I pointed out the weirdness in Dragon Boy of how they start out with a vehicle only to immediately have to abandon it? My Dragon Ball familiarity initially got the better of me here. I later found myself questioning why they didn't just reuse the vehicle once they cleared the mountains, until I remembered that a lack of capsules means a discarded vehicle is gone forever. Dragon Boy could have benefited from having a collection of tiny vehicles, but despite opening on interstellar travel, Tongpoo isn't a journey. It's a shipwreck story. Land vehicles don't have much story utility. No, what Dragon Ball takes from this story is the boy and girl staying in a capsule house and, naturally, more shared bathing antics. To be fair, if we treat this as a pilot, where the characters are bopping from planet to planet every week, elements like the capsules and the telekinesis could be expected to be paid off in those later installments. The interesting thing about both Dragon Boy and Tongpoo is that they feel incomplete, and I don't just mean in terms of the lack of narrative resolution. It feels like Dragon Ball is the necessary fusion of elements that each of these individual stories needed to create a whole greater than the sum of their parts. The technology aspect in Dragon Boy is half-cooked. In Tongpoo, it's at the forefront. Dragon Ball melds the two in a much more natural way. Tongpoo has the capsules, but no journey. Dragon Boy has the journey, but no capsules. Dragon Ball has both. Dragon Ball improves on or discards the ideas that go nowhere, refining the story elements and jokes. The girl character evolves from a completely useless princess to a completely useless space explorer to a far more integral character without losing those capricious traits that make her funny. Finally, the idea of a protagonist who is strong because of some hidden biological trait would be the biggest carry-through of all, except in Son Goku's case, it would be a secret even to him, which is narratively more compelling. Tong Tong has his wings, Tongpoo has his cybernetic enhancements, Goku in turn would have his Moonlight Curse, which, several years later, would be expanded into an alien heritage and an endless series of transformations. Yes, the dragon wings walked so Super Saiyan could run. Yeah, the wings walked. I'm good at writing. There are so many Dragon Ball elements in these two stories that it's fair to say that Dragon Ball began in 1983 rather than 1984. Maybe. These are necessary evolutionary links and pretty fun in their own right. Dragon Ball would not exist without these. So I hope you learned a lot more about Dragon Ball today than you expected to. I love me the first arc of Dragon Ball, and it's been over 10 years since I last covered it in Dragon Ball Dissection, so this was a lot of fun for me. Remember that you don't have to know Japanese to enjoy them, as these stories have been published in English in Akira Toriyama's manga theater, along with so many other Toriyama stories worth checking out. Many of them feature their own Dragon Ball parallels and inspirations. So we covered pre-Dragon Ball, but what was Toriyama doing with Dragon Ball after Dragon Ball GT? Well, he ultimately did a lot of things. Some of those things were a series broadly known as Nekomajin, a comedy about magical cat things that surprisingly allows us to check in on some of the goings-on of the dragon world. Some of these stories were named Nekomajin Z. Yes, Toriyama actually put a Z into the title of one of his series. I wonder what that could be a reference to. At any rate, we'll be looking at the Nekomajin series next time. Thanks so much for watching this installment of Dragon Ball Dissection. I look forward to all the comments asking what's coming next from people who stopped the video a minute and a half ago. But you didn't, and I thank you for that. I hope you'll like the video, comment, subscribe if you haven't, and support me on Patreon if you can. Don't forget I just started a new series, OZO, that compares Chodiki Sentai O-Ranger to its Americanized version, Power Rangers Zeo. Check it out! I'll see you next time!